I said, well, maybe it's time that we invite the community over here to present something to our society. So I got in touch with the society, and Lenny Brooks graciously accepted the invitation. So without further ado, Lenny's going to discuss a little bit about the history and the evolution of the Shaker communities here in Maine, and specifically in the Gloucester. Lenny.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I'm glad you found me a good alternative to 14 degrees. Good. I have brought with me today some of our official flyers, and there are some at the table there at the door, and I have some here, so if I didn't get around to you, please pick one up later. The talk I'm going to give today is taken entirely from our Shaker Library collection of photographs and other types of images. And that's one of the things I'd like to emphasize before I actually begin the talk. That is to say, our collections, particularly in the library. And the flyer has some of the information that you might like to know. I wanted to mention it to you in particular as members of the Historical Society. It is the Shaker Library, but we have a lot of items related to many aspects of local and Maine history. And if you are thinking about or even investigating genealogy, you might contact us because we might have something that would be very helpful. And all of that contact information is in the flyer, as well as our museum programs, which are listed at our website. But having said that about you maybe calling us, I wanted to kind of call on you today about a project that we're working on that we're calling the Duck Pond Shakers. And Duck Pond, which is now called Highland Lake, and is a body of water, as I'm sure all of you know, borders on Falmouth and Windham and Westbrook. Well, due to some earlier research, we have found out that there was a group of maybe 4 families with up to 14 or so members who lived in the Duck Pond area. And they eventually moved themselves from Duck Pond up to New Gloucester, or Sabbathday Lake, the Sabbathday Lake Shaker community. And we are working our way through the material that we have, plus, of course, checking out other local resources, including Maine Historical and various newspaper archives, etc. Names, and I'm just going to throw these out in case some of you are related to these individuals or know of information. The names that we've discovered so far are Joseph Brackett Sr., Sarah Lois Carl, C-A-R-Y-L, Abigail Frost, Joseph Frost, Molly Merrill Fuller, Betty Gibbs, Elias Hadlock, Hannah Merrill, Robert Wilson, Joseph and Enoch Waite. And I don't know if any of those names are familiar to you, but we suspect and have been able to confirm in some instances that they were the so-called Duck Pond Shakers. So if you ruminate on this and have any information, please give us a call. The number is listed in the brochure. Yes?
I think we have a bonnet, don't we, Penny, from the Shaker colony that was in Gorham? I think a black, very fragile bonnet from the mid-1800s.
From there, okay.
Yeah. A man gave it to us and he told us that's where it came from.
Was the Gorham Shakers. Well, very good. And David asked me to include some information on the Gorham community which I have done and we'll get to eventually here. Okay, well, thank you for that kind of attention. The pictures, as I said,
Could you leave those names with us?
yeah, sure.
Yeah, so we'll-
If you don't mind my scratching, and Route 202 to South Wyndham, turn right on Wyndham Center Road. Those are my instructions to get me here. It's not, it's not an archaeological site or anything.
Could be.
Yeah, well, it might be. It might be.
Yeah, in case we come across some information, you know, we'll leave it with the curator.
That'd be great, sure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So anyway, the images you're going to see, as I said earlier, come from our Shaker Library collection. And they really center around the late 1800s, early 1900s. And they will show you Shaker life at Sabbathday Lake, or New Gloucester, and Alfred, the two Shaker communities that were prominent in Maine history. Alfred was a Shaker community until 1931, when they moved to Sabbathday Lake. And of course, Sabbathday Lake remains an active community of Shakers to this day. So let's get started here.
Yeah, we're gonna dim the lights.
Yep. If this doesn't work, be prepared to do a Shaker song sing-along. Okay. Most of these pictures were taken by Brother Delmer Wilson, and I'll introduce you to him a little bit later. This is a photograph he took in the 1890s, which he called The Old and the New. And the old is the meeting house, 1794, to your left, and to the right is the new dwelling house of 1883. And those of you that have been to Sabbathday Lake will readily identify these buildings, I'm sure. The settled portion of the village, where the buildings are, is really the geographic center of Shaker Village. Shaker Village today consists of some 1,800 acres of land in both New Gloucester and Poland. So you're looking at the center of the center here. This is a view of the village, again, taken from the Cumberland County Atlas. It was a drawing made by an artist named Ferris Fulton Goist, which sounds like a Portland law firm, but it was actually a man who worked with a camera lucida or a camera obscura, and that gave him the images he needed to then make these drawings. So the larger of the views shows you the village, and if you can discern the lineup of buildings, that's important to remember, because Shaker villages were organized in lines. The meeting house was separate. It had a special place, of course, because it was the center of worship. Then the first row were the residences. The second row or back row were the workshops, and the third row were the barns. And that's the way a good and proper Shaker village was to be organized, and you can somewhat discern that arrangement in the background there. Of course, having said that, I have to point out to you immediately the inset view of the Poland Hill community, which is a mile away from Sabbathday Lake, away from the church family, as it's called. And that was the novitiate order, and you'll notice that it was centered around a courtyard, with the large building in the center being the granite dwelling house. The granite dwelling house stood into the 1950s, even though the Shakers had moved out in 1889. Some of you might remember that building as well, because it was extremely prominent on the hilltop 1 mile away from Sabbathday Lake. And there's a close-up of the dwelling house. Notice the cupola. You could go up into the cupola, which was also a bell tower, and you could look southerly and you could see the Maine coast, and you could look northerly and see Mount Washington, a spectacular view. And this was the so-called novitiate family. This is where you would go with your initial interest in becoming a Shaker. Poland Hill family, North family, novitiate order are the names of this village. Various names used for this village. This is the dwelling house at Alfred. It's actually the second dwelling house at Alfred. The first dwelling house, unfortunately, was destroyed by a fire in 1901. And this building, unfortunately, too, was burned down. In an interesting sidelight, it was burned down by a young girl who had been brought to the Shakers to be raised, and unfortunately, she was an arsonist. And she went up to the bell tower and started a fire there one day, and the building burned flat. That, again, was in the early 1900s. And this is just a panoramic view taken from the water tower. If you look very carefully off in the distance, you can see Sabbathday Lake, which gives the Shaker village its name. And the building in the foreground is the seed house. And of course, it's surrounded by what was then a new planting of apple trees on the hill. And you can make out again the meeting house and the dwelling house. And next to the meeting house is the ministry shop. And then way over to the left is the schoolhouse, which is now our library. Way over to the right is the trustee's office, or as it was originally known, the second dwelling house. One of the things I should tell you about the seed house, well, I suppose I should mention two things. Number one, the Shakers were the first in this country to sell packaged seeds. That was one of the innovations that they are famous for. The second thing is that that house there was actually a residence, was a farmhouse, the Allen family. And the Allen family converted to Shakerism when the village was formally organized in 1794. And they were required, as they were becoming Shakers, to consecrate all of their property, the buildings and the lands, to the Shaker village, which they did, and eventually their house was converted to the seed house. The same was true of the ministry shop. That was a pre-existing structure incorporated into the village. And again, way over on the right, the trustee's office was an earlier residence as well. That's how the villages in Maine, but elsewhere in Shakerdom, really got started, converting early families and consecrating the property to the Shakers. Now, I presume you're going to ask questions if you have them, right? Yes?
Did they move the buildings onto those locations, or did they happen to be already there? Or is that...
They were already there.
Okay.
There was, in Sabbathday Lake's case, there was a cluster of 5 family farms that were relatively close up and down what was then called the county road. And it was a similar story for Alfred. They had to move them in kind of a minor way, but no great distance at all. And this is just a picture of the city of Lewiston. This is the canal on Canal Street. and you can see some of the tenement houses and the factories that were there. This was included just to indicate that during the time period I'm talking about, late 1800s, early 1900s, there was more and more of an integration of Shaker life into the world. You and I are known as the world's people to the Shakers. And of course it was a controversy amongst the Shakers how far they should go in their, if you will, integration with the world. Should they remain separate, communal, semi-monastic, if you will, or should they take advantage of the progress in the world? And for several years, there were various, let's call them discussions, that went on amongst the Shakers. Well, one of the points of integration that was finally settled on was with the mill towns of Lewiston and Auburn, and in Alfred's case, Sanford, Springfield, Biddeford, and Saco. And an example of that is the Shakers had always produced their own textiles. They had spin houses and had been producing textiles since their various incorporations. Well, they could buy it cheaper through mills in Lewiston, and that's the way they began to go. Here's Portland, another point of contact with the world. This is Monument Square looking up Congress Street. On the right, you can see the Preble House, which was a hotel in Portland. Now the site of the Time and Temperature Building, as you probably know. See those big trees, those elm trees? That's the Longfellow House. That's where that's situated. And the Preble House was one of the hotels where the Shakers would stay and conduct sales in the city of Portland of their so-called fancy goods. What was a fancy good? You'll find out in a minute. The Shakers, after the Civil War, in the time period we're talking about, were dominated more and more by the female population. The Shaker sisters had probably always been the majority of the population within the Shaker villages, but certainly after the Civil War, they became the overwhelming majority. And this is a picture of some of the young sisters and the girls in front of the girls' shop. And you might want to take a look closely at their habit, their dress. The young sisters standing up in the back have an adaptation of the Shaker uniform that the sisters today wear, at least a Sunday meeting. And then the young girls, you can see down there on the steps, have on a very worldly type of fashion, if you will. You wore the uniform after you had made a decision to become a Shaker sister or a Shaker brother. But of course the brothers had their own uniform. And I should mention, just going back one quick minute here, one of the aspects of Shaker life that was very important to them was converts, of course. That's how they kept the church populated, if you will. The Shakers are a celibate group. They do not marry. So conversion was critical. And one of the things they did, beginning in the 1820s and 30s, was to establish what they called a children's order, which was open to accepting young boys and young girls, with the hope, of course, that they would indeed convert to Shakerism. Unfortunately, percentage-wise, it was not very remunerative, I guess I should say. Not many of them converted to Shakerism at all. Just about 10% of the total number. But anyway, that's kind of an aside. But the children here are shown because it's important to understand that they were the hoped-for converts to the church. And here are some of the Shaker brothers and two of the Shaker boys. Brother Delmer is the one on the left. He's the one who's actually taking this photograph, and as you can see, he has his arm behind his back and he's controlling the camera that way. Brother Stephen Gowen is the taller man, and then Charlie Callahan and William Duryea are the two boys excuse me, that you see there. The smaller boy is Charlie Callahan, who was described as being smart as a cricket, but unfortunately he did not stay a Shaker. This is a gathering of the sisters taken at the corner of the dwelling house. The lady in the middle, the sister in the middle, is Aurelia Mace, who was really quite a phenomenon, if I may say so. We'll talk a little bit more about her later on. But this again is another gathering of the sisters. Note the uniform. To the right of Sister Aurelia is Eldress Harriet Goodwin. She's wearing the old style uniform. The rest of them are wearing the new style uniform, one that the sisters wear today to meeting. This picture, interestingly enough, was taken by a Jenny Eastman, who was the staff photographer at the Poland Spring Resort. And Poland Spring, as you know, as many of you know, I assume, was a huge, nationally known resort that entertained presidents and many wealthy people. And it's located just a couple of miles up the road from Sabbathday Lake Shaker Village. And the Shakers and the Rickers, the founding family of Poland Spring, were very close friends. But I'll talk about that a little bit later. So this helps to give you a view of the Shakers and how they looked during this time period. This is inside a sister's workroom. On the left is Sister Elsie McCool, and then Jeannie Coolbroth and Cora Soul, numbers 2 and 3. Jeannie Coolbroth and Cora Soul left the Shakers even after they had taken on the title of sister. Sister Elsie remained a Shaker until her death in 1993. This picture was actually taken by Brother Delmer to illustrate the handiwork of the Shaker sisters. And you can see the rug. You can see that they're working on various knitted and sewn goods, embroidered goods, and the idea was to include this in a later catalog. But it also serves our purposes to show you what some of the daily labors were for the sisters. This is the dining room in the dwelling house, and it looks pretty much the same today. On the left is the sisters' table, and on the right is the brothers' table. And in the Shaker tradition, which is still held to today, the great bell of the dwelling house rings 10 minutes before every meal, and whatever you're doing, you stop and you go to the dwelling house, to the brothers' waiting room or the sisters' waiting room, and after a 10-minute wait, a buzzer sounds, and you come into the dining room to be seated on the left if you're a sister or female visitor, or on the right if you're a brother or male visitor. And after a silent grace, the meal begins. The only difference really in that tradition today is that the Shakers serve their meals buffet style. It used to be that those tables which would seat up to 8 people each, were subdivided into squares of 4 each. And what that meant was each square would have all of the food, the meat and vegetables, to serve 4 people. Likewise, the second square, and so on and so forth. Why did they do that? Because they didn't speak at mealtime. And the idea was you could either reach for the bowl of potatoes or you could point to something and somebody would hand it to you. Now talking is allowed. They did not speak at mealtime because they considered the meals to be a communion. And out of that respect, out of that aspect of it, they did not speak. This is a close-up picture of Brother Stephen Gowen. This was taken again by Brother Delmer. There were quite a few, if you will, formal portraits taken by the Shakers and of the Shakers as they embraced more and more the age of photography too. Brother Stephen was a particular favorite amongst the Shaker children because his father had been a Civil War veteran. Brother Stephen received part of his father's pension, and he would use it to buy candy for the kids. So that made him very popular amongst the youngsters. And here's Brother Stephen with the hay rack, taking the sisters at Alfred, because he was actually an Alfred Shaker, out to go blueberrying. Here's a picture of the young girls. See the 2 young people right in the middle of the gazebo of the swing? Those are Sister Elsie's twin sisters. And this obviously was a posed photograph. The gazebo and the swing were made by the Shaker brothers for the young girls. And it was situated right out back of the girls' shop, or in this case, in front of a building called the Sisters' Shop. Here are the young boys sledding right in front of the greenhouse and the cow barn. And you could, I don't know if enough of you have been to Sabbathday Lake, but if you've been there and can picture where the water tower is situated, right at the top of the hill, you could slide or ski down from the water tower right to the lake in a straight shot. You had to be careful when you crossed the county road, but there wasn't enough traffic at that point to be really potentially harmful. And that was one of the recreational activities: skiing, snowshoeing, sledding, etc. They had a rather liberal dose of fun and entertainment for the kids. The greenhouse was built by Brother Delmer in the early 1900s, and for a few years, God bless you, and for a few years they grew seedlings there, which they, of course, used on the farm, but also sold to Lewiston and Auburn. And eventually it was taken down because the seedling industry wasn't too lucrative. The cow barn burned down in 1955. And here is a Sunday school pageant involving some of the children in what we think is an Easter pageant. And you can see they really dressed to the nines. These costumes, some of which survive in our collection, were made by the sisters and worn by them and the young girls and boys for some sort of production. I'm not exactly sure what the theme was, but it was Easter time and spring and all that entails. The Shakers had Sunday school. The Shakers also had the town schoolhouse on their property. which was built by town money and Shaker money, and it was used as a schoolhouse from 1880 to the 1950s. And then New Gloucester built a consolidated memorial school. This is the schoolhouse at Alfred, and you can see the children lined right up there. The only story I have, see the man to the right with the round hat? Can you see him? That's Elder John Vance, who was the leader of the Shakers at Alfred and Sabbathday late in the very late 1800s. And he was also the school's district superintendent, and he'd also been, when he was younger, a school teacher. One of the school teachers was, going into the early 1900s, was a woman named Kate Pike, whose sister, Eva May Libby, was actually a Shaker's sister. But anyway, Kate taught in this building, and of course you can't really see it here, but the schoolhouse was halfway between the church family of Shakers at Alfred and the second family of Shakers at Alfred. They were really very close, and right in between was the schoolhouse. Well, Kate Pike, when lunchtime came, would go to the church family and say, "What are you having for dinner?" Then she'd go down the road just a little piece to the second family and say, "What are you having for dinner?" And that's how she chose where she went for dinner, whatever met her fancy. This is the Sabbathday Lake Quartet, which was a formally organized group of Shaker singers. This is one of the aspects about this time period that's important to note. The Shakers were undergoing formal music education, particularly for their singing. And most of that effort came from the Canterbury, New Hampshire Shaker village, who sent teachers to the Shakers. And this is the Sabbathday Lake Quartet, as I said, who performed not only for the community, that is to say the Shaker community, but also particularly the Rickers, to mention them again, of Poland Spring. Now this is Sister Aurelia Mace, who came to the Shakers when she was 6 months old. She came along with her family, her parents and her siblings. She grew up a Shaker. They actually left for a while, but came back when Sister Aurelia was still, I think, about 5 years old. This is a picture taken in the living room at the trustee's office. She was a trustee, which is to say she was a business agent for the Shakers. And interestingly enough, she was born in 1835, died in 1910, and we always compare that to Halley's Comet and also Mark Twain. She was a very interesting person, corresponded with Leo Tolstoy, the Library of Congress. She had many influential friends that she met through Poland Spring. And this is a picture taken on her 70th birthday, and the cake was sent down from the Poland Spring kitchens, and it wishes her a happy birthday from your brother Edward, and Edward was Edward Ricker. So she was really, what shall I say? She was really a very prominent Shaker. Christmas, up until 1876, Christmas was celebrated as a day of fasting, which doesn't seem very holiday-like-ish to us, but it was a very quiet day of prayer and meditation. But then in 1876, it was decided to begin to celebrate with gift-giving, Christmas trees, Christmas pageant, etc. And this is a picture taken in 1910 of the chapel in the dwelling house, with obviously the tree, Sister Mamie Curtis sitting next to it, and all of those gifts surrounding her. The gifts mostly were handmade by the sisters and brothers. And for some reason, we're not exactly sure why, they only had a tree every other year for the first couple of decades or so that they celebrated at all. This is a picture of Brother Delmer and his brother Harry, his natural brother Harry. Brother Delmer and his brother were sent to the Shakers by their mother when she was widowed. Several years later, when she remarried and could raise the boys, she came back to get them. Harry left with her, Brother Delmer did not, and he died a Shaker in 1961 when he was 88 years old. But this is a picture taken in the front room, just where Sister Aurelia had her picture taken too. And you can see obviously that there were visits by family for the Shakers as well. But they had to stay in the trustee's office. They were not allowed down to the dwelling house because that was private. This is a picture of a great bunch of Shaker fun seekers at Old Orchard Beach. These are some of the Alfred Shakers. And don't they look like fun seekers? This was a picture, this is actually a tintype photograph. And the tintype was like the, I used to say Polaroid of its day, but I don't know if anybody remembers Polaroids now. But anyway, with a tintype, you could take a picture upon your arrival, and of course it would be ready virtually instantly. And this was a tintype photograph taken of the Alfred Shakers when they were visiting at Old Orchard Beach. One of the huge advantages that the Shakers had at Alfred was that they had sold a right-of-way to the railroad, the Portland and Rochester Railroad, right through their property, which gave them a free pass on the railroad. So they could travel to Portland or the other way, all the way to Boston. There was a block, like an old horse block, right in the middle of their field, and all they had to do was put up a flag, and the train would stop for them to carry them either way. Another bunch of Shaker fun seekers at Higgins Beach in Scarborough. The man sitting way in the back, and I think that's a Homburg that he's wearing, that's Elder William Dumont, the leader of the main Shakers at the time. In the early 1900s, there was a huge influx of immigrants from Eastern Europe, and these were some Bulgarian, one of their last names is Dolchev, I can't remember the others, were part of that wave that came in. They heard about the Shakers, they investigated the Shakers, and they became Shakers, in this case, at Hancock, Massachusetts. The lady to the left is Sister Frances Hall. Yes?
I know I'm kind of out of sequence here, but I'm not familiar with what did it mean to become a Shaker? What was required of you? And could you come and go as you pleased?
Well, to answer that second question first, no. What happened, in order to become a Shaker, if you had an interest, let's assume you're an adult.
Okay.
If you had an interest with the being a Shaker, you had to contact them in some way. Okay? You couldn't just show up and expect to be accepted, although that did happen amongst a group known as the Winter Shakers. But in the usual procedure, what you could do, what you had to do, was contact the village. The village would respond, maybe with an invitation to come to the village, maybe a suggestion that you not join, whatever, okay? But let's say you were invited to come to the village. You'd go to the village, you would be part of the novitiate order, which at that point, in the time period we're talking about here, was about a year in length. And if at the end of that time period you were still accepting of the Shaker way of life, and they were accepting of you, which meant that they thought you could practice Shaker communalism, celibacy, confession of sin, pacifism, all kind of basically, then you'd be welcomed in as the new brother or the new sister. Does that kind of answer that question?
Right. Now, was there a language problem with the immigrants when they came?
Not that's been recorded. Okay? Any other questions?
I had one.
Yes.
Going back to the Christmas, so Shakers were Christians?
They are
No,
part of
yeah.
the Christian
They-
church.
They are, okay.
Right.
Yeah.
Yep. They're what some theologians call radical Christians because of their particular lifestyle, like the celibacy, the communalism, the confession, and all that stuff. But they are part of the Christian church. Yeah. Yes.
To me, it's very quizzical that the numbers died out so quickly. Because you look at nuns in the Catholic Church. Yes, their numbers are decreasing, but a lot of their tenets are the same. And they still at least have a following. And this group is almost extinct now. So you wonder why that is.
Well, historians would point to the fact that, and I kind of hinted at this, tried to bring this out, that as the Shakers kind of let go of their ancient ways of life and began to integrate with the world, gave up their traditional crafts and jobs and so on and so forth, as the distinctiveness of the Shaker faith began to disappear, people began to wonder, why would I join, you see? And that had a big effect. Also, the general change in U.S. history, or U.S. life, was that the Shakers were agriculturally based. Well, after the Civil War, of course, the country was industrializing. So that men in particular didn't look at the Shaker way of life down on the farm as particularly fulfilling. It was still pretty much acceptable to a lot of women to join the Shakers. So the male population began to decrease as the country industrialized.
Did they never want to change their celibate ways so that they could maintain their population? It just was not even considered.
Then, that's right.
Not even.
It was not considered fully and completely. Was it suggested by some of the Shakers? Yes. But it was never accepted. Then that would be the absolute end of Shaker beliefs. Here's a picture of the Poland Spring House.
Wow.
Many of you remember this hotel, I'm sure. Could accommodate 400 guests. And it's put here to emphasize the contact between the Rickers and the Shakers. And also, the Rickers ended up in Poland because of a land swap with the Shakers in Alfred. There was a man who owned this property, and this is going back to the 1780s, whose name was Benjamin Ring, or Rang. He wanted to be a Shaker. At that point in Shaker history, the only active village was the one at Alfred. Sabbathday Lake was not yet formally open as a Shaker community. Well, the Shakers in Alfred wanted property owned by Jabez Ricker, who lived right next door to them in their village. And they tried to persuade Jabez Ricker to swap land in Poland, or swap land in Alfred, with this land in Alfred, okay? And it took quite a while, but eventually he did agree to the land swap, so that he and his family took over the land in Poland, and the Shakers got his land in Alfred, which also included a mill privilege, which was what they really wanted. So the Rickers came to Poland because of the Shaker land swap. Anyway, the original Poland Spring House opened in 1876. It underwent many, many renovations, and this is what it looked like about 1900. And then the Shakers and the Rickers became very friendly. The Rickers invited the Shakers up for various occasions. They allowed them to sell their wares in the hotel lobby. And there were many associations that developed between the Shakers and the Poland Spring guests, etc., etc. And the man flying over the hotel, I've forgotten his name, I'm sorry to say, was the first person to fly across country in a biplane. And he was invited up to the Poland Spring Resort at one point to show his stuff. And the Shakers, the Rickers, always knew how to market their hotel. And one of their big promotions was a baseball team, which was becoming a new fanaticism in 1900. And also, not only baseball, but skiing. And also, not only the Shakers, but Maine Native Americans, because the Rickers wanted to emphasize our heritage. All as selling points. And not that they weren't sincere friends, but there was also that kind of commercial angle.
Was the Poland Spring itself independent of the Rickers, or was that operated by the Ricker family?
Operated by the Rickers.
Were they the ones that instituted it?
Yep, yep. They began to sell the water commercially and nationally in the 1840s. Yes. The Rickers controlled everything in Poland, period. This is Elder Henry Green, nicknamed the Old Man of the Mountains, because for 50 years he traveled up into the hotels there, selling particularly, or obviously during the summer trade. You can see his wagon full of fancy goods. And I am going to show you some fancy goods in a moment. I didn't lie to you earlier. But this is a picture of him underway on the route that he had. Also, the Shakers had extensive sales routes. I mentioned packaged seeds. That's when the sales routes began. And they were jealously guarded, Christians being Christians, they were jealously guarded by the villages, one from the other. And as a matter of fact, there was quite a dispute between the Canterbury, New Hampshire Shakers and the Alfred, Maine Shakers at one point about the seed routes. And the Canterbury Shakers thought the Alfred Shakers were becoming interlopers into their seed routes. On a separate matter, the Alfred Shakers contacted Canterbury asking them for the sale or the exchange of pigs for the Alfred Shaker farm. And Canterbury wrote back and said, "Fat chance," because of what you did with the seed route. So anyway, So the sales routes were kind of the continuation of the seed routes. This was the way they were commercializing, the way the Shakers were commercializing the Shaker goods. Yes?
Yeah, I mentioned earlier that I visited Albany's community this last summer, and one of the things that was discussed there, besides seeds, was the fact that they were very much into herbals. They had well over 140 different types of herbs that they grew in the Albany area and sold either as a dry product or converted to medicinals. And they had their own routes and a very extensive means of sales throughout the whole New York and New England area with those products.
Absolutely.
And they were pretty much some of the very first people that were knowledgeable in the ways of medicinal herbs and sold them as products.
Well, I remember the lady saying also too that they were known for the quality.
Yeah.
People
Yes.
could be,
Quality control.
Yeah.
quality control, they could be guaranteed if they said it was this herbal, it was that herbal.
Yeah, that's right. Okay, so there's Elder Henry. Now this is a picture of the trustee's office, which originally was the second dwelling house where the older members of the community lived. It became the trustee's office in 1880. So what does that mean? Well, that means this is where the Shaker store is located. This also means this is where you would come if you were a visitor to meet with the trustees. Even if you had a relative who was a Shaker and you were there to see them, they would come up from the dwelling house typically to meet you in this building. You were not allowed, as I mentioned briefly earlier, to go to the dwelling house. And this is still the home to the Shaker store, as well as a guest house and retreat center. This is the interior of the Shaker store, and here are the fancy goods that I was talking about. These are all handmade items by the Shakers. On the left is the Shaker cloak, which was made very popular by Mrs. Grover Cleveland when she wore one to her husband's inauguration in the 1880s. And as you kind of scan the picture, you can see in the glass case, on top of the glass case, a horsehair clothes brush. You can see oval carriers made by the Shakers and used as ladies' carry-alls and sewing kits. You can see a doll standing up there, dressed in the Shaker sisters' uniform. On the table in the front are knitted and crocheted goods, sewing stand in the glass case, and then the rest of the glass case and the glass cases behind are filled with poplar ware. Poplar ware was made from the poplar tree. In this neck of the woods, and actually there are true poplars up here, but I won't go into that. Poplar ware here, or poplar, was not good for furniture, not good for firewood, but you could cut it down, take the round logs into the mill, square them off, and then slice them very thin, then shred them like spaghetti, put them on a loom, weave them into something that was called poplar cloth, and then take that, cut it into various sizes and shapes on top of a wooden base. And you had jewelry cases, you had sewing cases, you had poplar cases for men's collars, handkerchief boxes, etc. Over the course of Shaker poplar making from 1860 to 1960, there were over 125 different shapes and sizes that they made. So that's what you're looking back there, and you can see they're decorated with satin ribbons and bows and lined with the satin as well. And here's a close-up of the oval carriers. The early Shakers were famous for their oval boxes, which were the Tupperware of their day. They were very utilitarian and for the storage of everything, flour, sugar, hardware, etc. The Shakers used them and then they sold them to the world. Well, they kind of went out of favor with the coming of items like tinware, but they were revived in the very late 1800s, the 1890s, as the oval carriers that you see there. Those were the ladies' carry-alls and the sewing baskets, okay? And that's Brother Delmer in his workshop in the boys' shop. This is the beehive. This is part of the sister shop, and this is where they would finish off the poplar wear, where they would line it with the velvet and satin and leather, etc. In the background you can see some of the dolls that they've worked on, and the poplar wear is on the table to the left. Picture to show the influence or the central influence of agriculture in Maine during this time. This was actually a postcard sent to Sister Jenny Mathers, a Shaker sister, from her Uncle Ed, who lived up in Aroostook County. The cow barn with the interior silo, and they're loading in ensilage. Agriculture, as I said earlier, the real center of Shaker life as it is today. They have herb gardens, vegetable gardens, orchards, livestock, including sheep and Scottish Highland cattle. This is the cow barn at Alfred, largest cow barn in New England at the time of its construction. When the Alfred Shakers moved out of Alfred, 1931, the Brothers of Christian Instruction bought the property. They turned it into a school, and this became a hockey rink for the young boys. This is the dairy at Alfred. They, of course, had the cow herd, and this building is where they processed the milk and cream. And there's Elder Henry in the background with the wagon full of milk cans, which he would drive down to that railroad stop in the field and send the product on to Boston. This is a close-up of Elder Henry in his workshop. If you look very carefully, you can see some of the oval carriers that he has made. Those three boys in the back are his apprentices. Elder Henry did not care for children in the least. He described them at one point as jailbait, so that you can imagine that he did not work with the boys for an extended period of time. This is just to show you the portable saw that Brother Delmer made for the cutting up of the firewood. Shaker Brothers and hired help here. When I first went to volunteer at Shaker Village in 1978, the overwhelming amount of heat was generated by the wood-burning stoves that were in the dwelling house and other buildings. They did not have extensive central heating, oil central heating. This is down at the sawmill. Interesting to note, all of these men you see here are hired help. The mill was in operation from 1853 till 1941, and it was taken down in 1949. This is just a quick picture of Sanford. This is the Goodall Mill. And the Goodalls were as friendly with the Alfred Shakers as the Rickers were to Sabbathday Lake. Real benefactors to those communities. This is a close-up of the overshot wheel in the mill. This is the second largest overshot wheel in the country, 90 feet in circumference.
Is this Alfred or?
Sorry, Sabbathday Lake.
Sabbathday.
Sabbathday Lake.
Is that a metal wheel or wooden?
Wooden. And then to the left, the meeting house at Alfred. To the right, the ministry shop at Alfred. This was what was burned out in 1901. Dwelling house on the other side of the road, the meeting house and the ministry shop went as well. And if you come back to Sabbathday Lake, you'll see that the meeting house and the ministry shop at Sabbathday Lake were situated in the same way as they had it at Alfred. 1885, this photograph was taken. I'm speeding up because I'm well aware that I'm talking a great deal. This is 1885. The only known picture of a Shaker meeting taken in the last century. This was taken at the Sabbathday Lake Meeting House by the official photographer of the Poland Spring Resort. The Rickers requested special permission to take the picture, and of course it was granted. You do not kill the fatted calf. Over on the left is the Shaker leadership, and you can make out the Shakers in the front rows, the sisters, the brothers, and the young boys.
I got a question. In Albany, they had the large common area, and then in the far back, they had bleachers.
Yep.
And did they have the bleachers set up here for the visitors or
Yep.
for those that were non-takers?
Right.
Is that,
Well,
that was in the back?
and the world's people also are in the
Yeah.
benches too.
Yeah, benches.
But that's the bleacher seats way in the back there.
Yeah, it was kind of interesting in Albany. Some of the elders would actually sit above the assembly and they watch the bleachers to see what the interest level was. And if people kept coming back, they might give them an invitation to join the, as a novice. So, different ways of recruiting.
Yeah, oh yes, absolutely. This is Elders Lizzie Noyes and Sister Edith Green. Sister Edith Green was a West Indian by birth, and it's an example of the Shakers and a limited integration with ethnic groups. The Shaker villages in Ohio and Kentucky did have black members. This is just a quick picture. One of Brother Delmer's fixations was Sabbathday Lake. This is Loon's Point on Sabbathday Lake. Elder William Dumont, Jenny, the horse Jenny, and her colt. One of the commendable aspects of Elder William's life was that when he was much younger and the horses took sick at Sabbathday Lake, I forget what year it was, but it was encephalitis or something like that. He stayed up for 2 nights in a row, 24/7, bringing them back to health. The Shakers underway. The near automobile is the Poland Spring touring car. Elder William in the front there. Brother Delmer over on the right, driving the Shaker's Pierce Arrow. One of the Shaker sisters could remember very well going out on these excursions. They'd come to a hill, and everybody'd have to get out of the wagon, and the horse would take the wagon up to the top of the hill and they'd walk up to save the horse, so it wouldn't have to haul them up the hill. I was asked to show pictures of Gorham. The Gorham Shaker Village was located at what is now the corner of 202 and Queen Street, the Gray Road. This is the dwelling house right at the corner of Queen Street and 202. This is the interior. What I wanted you to see here, another Shaker trademark, the Shaker pegs up in the attic. Across the street from the dwelling house is the trustee's office, kind of buried in the trees, or at least it used to be. Whoop. That one's not going to cooperate. Well, I have to skip that. And here's a Shaker barn, supposedly, that was moved off the Shaker property onto another farm in Gorham. The Shakers were at Gorham as a formally established community only from 1808 to 1819, although the very first public proclamation of the Shaker gospel was in 1785, right in the center of Gorham, in the town square. But they never got the critical mass they needed for a proper village. So that's it.